Welcome to another module. In this module, we'll dive into something super exciting, uploading images. Because thus far in our project, we're of course able to create new posts, but with text only, right? We fetch a title, we fetch some content. Now that's nice, but if we're really honest, it's not super exciting. So in this module, we're going to change this. Every post we create will from now on also have an image. And of course, not an image we as a developer decide, but an image which the user should be able to upload. So let's implement this step by step in this module. So the file upload is working, but we still got a lot of work to do. On the server-side code in posts.js on our routes here, we obviously have our Multer code in place here, but we're not using the file we stored. We're not really doing anything with that file, are we? We're not storing the path in the database, for example, and we're of course not passing the path back to the user. Now, to do that, we can utilize something Multer does for us. It does actually give us the information about the file it's stored in the request body in our handler function here. So when we create a new post which we want to store in the database, we can also store an image path, let's say. Now that image path is something our model doesn't expect though. So let's first of all go to the post model and add a new field to it, image path, which is of type string and which is required. And it will simply be the path to the file on our backend. And with that added, let's go here, image path. And now the path I want to store here should be a URL to that file. Now to construct that URL, I will first of all get the URL of our server and store it in a URL constant. We can get that from the request. There is a protocol property which returns whether we're accessing the server with HTTP or HTTPS. Then I'll add : / to create a full URL. And then I can get my current host with request get host. Now this simply constructs a URL to our server. And I want to have this because now my image path will be my URL. And then /images, this is where we store our files. And now important, we of course store it in backend images, but we will configure this folder to be accessible directly after our domain. And I will show you how this works in a second. So I just want to be able to enter my domain /images and then the file name. And that's the part Multer does for us. We can access request, and then there will be a file property provided by Multer, and that will have the file name. So now this is the image path I want to store in the database. Thereafter, we return a response, and there, of course, I don't just want to return the post ID, we probably want to return the entire post instead. So let's return a post here, which is a JavaScript object, where we actually have an ID field, which is created post _ID, because remember, it's stored on _ID in MongoDB, where we have a title that will be created post title, where we'll have a content. This will of course be created post content, and where we also will have that image path, which is created post image path. So yes, we could just return created post, but I wanted to remap that ID. One way to shorten this though is you can use a next-gen JavaScript feature where you create a new object and then you use the spread operator to copy all properties of another object, and then you simply add or override some selected properties. So this will create an object with all the properties of the created post, and it will set that extra ID here. So this is the post I want to return. Now let's use that on the client in the post service. There I will now get back my post. So the data I get back will actually be a post property next to the message, which will be of type post. At least it will have all the properties this post has. And therefore we can extract the ID of the post, which was created, with post ID here. And we can also extract the title and content like this, but we can also stick to the ones we got from the forum. They should be the same. Now, the image path is something our frontend model doesn't reflect. So let's go to that model and also add the image path here. It should be a string. And in posts service, we now of course have to use this when we create a new post here. There I'll set image path to response data post image path. And we also got an error down there where we construct a new post. Here where we update a post, we don't have an image path yet, though this will soon change. For now, let's simply set it to null. We also have an error in the post create component now. There we also construct a new post, and there we should also set image path to null for now. And we'll revisit this later. So now we're getting back that post information, and we're using it to store it in our post on the front end, on the newly created post there. Now, when we're getting posts, which happens when we visit our messages page, we of course also transform posts here, and there we should also add the image path. So here I'll set image path equal to post image path, because I know what I get back from my server should have an image path for every post, because we're now saving this. And on our server-side code for this get route where we get all posts, well, we simply return the data from our database, and the image path should be saved from now on. Of course, our older posts won't have images. We'll simply delete them in a second. So now we're adding this image path on the front end too. We're returning the data from the backend. Let's next make sure that we actually render this on the screen on the front end. So with the image path extracted, we want to display that, of course. And to display that, let's go to the post list component, which is where we do display the post data. And thus far, we only output the header, and then in the expanded box for the posts, just the content. Now I also want to have my image in here. And you can style this however you want. I'll add a little div here. Class could be post image, but that really is up to you. And in there, I want to have an image. Now I'll again bind my alt tag here to post title. And the source, well, that should be bound to post image path, right? Because that should be a URL to the image. Now let's work on the styling in a second. Let's first of all see if that works. If I go to my messages here, you see already I get an error here and I see no images anywhere. That's all not working at all. Now, why is this not working? It's not working because we are, of course, requesting an invalid image path. We got no image paths for our older posts. So let's simply delete these. If we now reload the page, this error still is there. Now let's go to the network tab. Let's check the request where we get our posts. There, in the preview of the response, we have our posts array. And indeed, in the database, the image path is missing. So back on our server, when we store our post here, the image path wasn't saved because we haven't created a post since we added that functionality. So let's delete that too, and let's create another new post. So new post, spring is there. All the nice weather, how awesome is that? And most importantly, let's pick an image, the right one, of course, not the video. Let's save that. And now we actually still have a problem here. We do see that we did try to request something there. And if I reload that page, we see it here. So now we at least try to reach out to a real file. In the network, we can see this. And in the posts which we fetched, we can also see that now there is an image path, and that is our URL. But we fail to fetch that image. Now the reason for that is that we didn't grant access to that images folder on our backend. By default, and that's a good thing, all your files are unaccessible. You control with your routes what can be accessed. And we don't give access to the image folder anywhere. Now to change this, I will simply go to my app.js file and I will add something there. I want to make that images folder statically accessible, which means any requests targeting that folder should simply be forwarded, should be allowed to continue. I'll do that, let's say after my body parser middleware calls, with another middleware I add with app use, and that's a middleware built into Express. It will only apply to any requests which have /images in them, so where I try to access this. And if that is the case, the middleware I want to add is one shipping with Express, the static middleware. The static middleware simply is added like this, and this means any requests targeting /images will be allowed to continue and fetch their files from there. However, this won't work because /images is actually incorrect. It's hidden away under backend images. So to map this, I will import something, a package shipping with node.js, the path package, which is added by requiring path. This allows us to construct paths in a way that's safe to run on any operating system and, well, simply is constructed correctly. I can construct a path to my backend images folder then with path join backend images. And this will simply make sure that requests going to images are actually forwarded to backend images. With that out of the way, if we save that and we reload on the front end, the error is gone and we see the image here. Maybe a little bit too big, we could argue about that, but we can see that we can load the image. Now let's fix the styling real quick by going to our front-end code. And there I'm wrapping this in post image, right? So let's go there. Let's add that post image class to the respective CSS file. Let's give it a width of 100%. And then let's target post image and the image inside of there. And let's give that a width of 100% of the surrounding container. And now if we have a look at this, now this looks much better already. Now you could change this a bit more. Maybe give it a drop shadow, little box shadow here. 1 pixel, let's say 5 pixels. And then an RGBA code, which looks like this. That, of course, is totally up to you how you want to style this. Yeah, I like this look. So now we got our image here loaded from the backend, uploaded by our application. Now, there's one thing you might have noticed. If you add a new image here, and you upload and you post, then we got an error before. Now that's also gone now that we implemented this all correctly and we made sure that the data is saved and that we also access it correctly statically. Now with that, we're able to upload new posts or create posts and upload images. We're able to display these images. The next step is, of course, that we're able to also edit these posts, because right now that doesn't work because we got no image value there. So let's make sure we can also edit images and not just view them one time or upload them one time. For that, we of course need to work on the post create component. There, we right now have nothing in place to edit existing images. Now, the first thing I want to do there is when we create a new form, for the image, we always have null as a starting value right now. Now, when we edit an image, I actually want to also use my image path. So when we set a value here, I'll set a value for image, and that value will be this post image path. Now that's a string, but we can still assign this here as a value for this input. We're not limited to adding a file here. Now with that, we're already prepared to handle that in the form. And if I now reload this, maybe save that file before I do so, now it works without errors. Now if we submit this, we of course execute a method in our post service. We execute update post. Now there, of course, we have to differ. between two cases. Do we have a string image or not? Because if we got a string image, well, then I just want to send a JSON request. If we got an object, so if we got a file, well, then I, of course, want to upload this as form data. It'll be a put request nonetheless, but the payload simply differs. So here we're constructing a new post, and first of all, I'm expecting my image here. And this will actually be of type any, or we can be more precise, it will be a file, or, with that pipe operator, a string. So it can be either. Now let's remove the post here, and let's now check what it is. First of all, let's go back to post create component, and maybe pass it. Here, when we do save the post, let's pass this form value, and then image. So let's pass this extra value to update post. But now back in the post service, here I want to check what we have. So if the type of, it's a built-in function, if the type of image is equal to object, we can't check for file here, but a file will be an object, a string will not. So if that is equal to object, then we want to create a form data object. Else, I know that I have a string here as an image, and therefore I want to send normal JSON data. So if we have an object, I'll create my new post data here with a new form data object. And as we did it for, well, posting that for the first time, we'll then call append here and append the title, which will be the title we get as an argument here. Then, of course, do the same for the content, and then add our file. So here I then append my image, which is the image I'm getting here, and where the title will be the file name. So this is the relevant thing if we're uploading a new post. Else, here, I want to create new post data, which is of type post, which is simply a JavaScript object, where I will have an ID, which is the ID I got here, where I have my title, where I have my content, and where I have my image path, which is the image I'm getting, which in this case would be a string. So in either way, post data is what I want to send, so let's send it here. Now, TypeScript doesn't understand that post data will always exist, so let's initialize it here as a variable and not as constants here in the else block, like that. Post data therefore will be of type post, or it will be a form data object. And now we can safely send post data here. Now down there, we simply refer to the ID we got as an argument anyways, and the post which we want to store as an updated post is a post I have to create here. So that will then be a post, type post, which simply is an object constructed as we are constructing it here. One important difference though, we of course get back the image path from the server, because if we uploaded a new image, that will have changed. So I will actually expect to get back a response where I somehow can access my image. For now, let's say image path, we'll probably have to revisit this, as you can see, or as you can tell by the error here. So we got the first steps in place. We're not done yet, but we should be able to send data to this endpoint. Of course, some work needs to be done on that endpoint too. So let's move over back to the server and let's work on that put endpoint. Now I also want to use multer there, so I can just copy the logic from the post endpoint and add it here too, to extract files there too. Here we are. So now I'm also extracting an image there before I run my function. And now in my function, I of course want to store my uploaded file. But that depends on whether we're getting a new file or if I'm just getting a string. Now that's relatively easy to do. Let's simply output console log request file to see what we get in the cases where we do replace the file and where we don't. Now for this, we need to fix our front-end code, which right now won't work. I'll simply comment out the line which is throwing the error. That doesn't work either. So I'll simply set this to an empty path here. That's all right, we'll fix this later. So let's now go back where we added this and let's hit save post. Now I failed to really submit this because this check in the PostGrid component actually detects that, of course, the image path we assigned is not a valid file, right? It's a string, it's not a file, it's not making it through our Mime-Type check. Well, to handle that case, I can go to my Mime-Type Validator, and at the very beginning, I'll add a check where I see if control value, if the type of that is equal to string. If it is, then that's okay, but then I immediately want to return an observable. So I'll add a new import from RxJS, auth. Auth is a quick and easy way of adding or creating an observable which will emit data immediately. Here I will simply return auth. Return will therefore make sure that the other code doesn't run. Auth null. So this will now simply return that this is valid. With this, if I go back and I hit save, still doesn't work. The reason for that is that when I initialize the post on this page in ng on init, I'm actually reaching out to get post in my service, right? And in get post, if we take a closer look, I'm sending a get request to this URL here for a given post, but I'm not getting the image path here. I'm not expecting it either. So instead, I should manipulate this and expect the image path here to be of type string, also separated by colons, not by semicolons. And I need to work on the backend, of course, on my get request for that single post here, because it will actually contain my image path. I'm fetching it from the database, so the image path will be part of the response. But I then return it here in the post service, and I'm not handling it here in the post create component. There where I get the post, image path, I set it to null. Well, now I should set it to image path now that I edited the type in the post service. So now if this loads, I can submit this. Now let's go to our server, and there we see undefined is logged. And that makes sense because I wanted to see what gets logged if we try to put data and we got no file. And we have no file here because what we submit is the default image path, which is a string. So that's great. That means that request file is undefined if we're submitting a string. So I can simply check if request file, if it's there, and if it's there, I know a new file was uploaded. Then we can use the logic from the post route here, where we construct a URL and where we then store this URL together with the new file name in the image path. So I get my URL here. I'll add my image path variable here, and I'll then set image path here equal to URL plus, and now really just the logic we have up here, URL plus images plus the file name. This happens if we got a file. Otherwise, and that will be my default value for image path, I try to get it from the body image path. It should be part of the body then, because in my post service, where I put my data, so where I send that put request, I do add post data, which in the case that we're not uploading a file, so in this case, which will have an image path property, which will be the image, which will be the string. So now it should really save that to the database as an image. Now, if I edit this again here, let's try that. Let's save this. And we got no error here. We can also confirm that this is all working correctly by going back to the server. And before updating, let me console log my post here. By the way, of course, I should use image path too. So here I will actually set image path equal to image path. That image path now is either the path we already had or the path of the newly uploaded image. So now again, let's save that, restart. Let's edit this, hit save post here. And if we go back, we see that there in the post which gets logged, we have that old image link. Now let's try uploading a new one for that image. So I'll choose pick image here. Pick the same image actually, but still we replaced the path with a file. So this will cause a new upload. Let's hit save. And something seems to fail on the back end here. We can see here, we can tell by the output that actually a new image was stored because that name is different, because the time stamp here is different. But we then still got an error, well, that we tried to edit the ID. Well, we did fix that before. Let's quickly have a look what broke it. Well, yes, if we upload a new file here, we're not passing an ID, and therefore it would generate a new one. So what we have to do is we have to append post data. We have to append that ID, of course. Otherwise, we get no ID on the server. We try to generate a new one. We try to save that, and it breaks. So if that changed, let's try this again. Save this. Now this looks much better. And now if we inspect this, we got the updated file there too. Now you can see that we keep on adding files here. This is something I actually will not care about here. Because, for one, it's not that untypical to keep files, even if users upload new ones. You might want to use them for machine learning, anything like that. If you wanted to clean them up, you would typically not do that when the user uploads a new file, because that would require unnecessary processing power during the request. Instead, you would probably use some worker process, which runs every night, every X hours, which basically checks which files are not mentioned in your database anymore, and it would then delete the files. Now that is definitely beyond the scope of this course, so I will leave it like this. And again, keep in mind, this is not just some reason I'm coming up with. You do often keep such files around. So we'll do the same here in this course. So now that's it for this module. We achieved a lot. We added file upload. I showed you how you could implement a file picker that looks good, how you can then use it and validate the input, the file which was chosen, with your own Mime-Type Validator, how you then also can upload that file and handle it on the server, and of course, how you then also can update it by being flexible regarding whether you're getting the old path, which is a string, or a new file which should be re-uploaded. We implemented all that in this module. We're still not done with the overall app. There are more cool features to be added, but this was a huge step forward, and in my opinion, it made sure that our application looks and feels quite a lot nicer. So, image upload, how do we implement it? Well, let's start with creating a new post, and there I want to add a new button, let's say below the title, but it's really up to you where you position this, of course. And when we click this button, a file picker should open. And in that file picker, we should then be able to pick an image file. We probably also want to see a preview of the image here then. And I, of course, also want to be able to then hit Save Post and upload that image, store that image somewhere on our server, and store a path to the image so that we know where it's stored in the database. Because we will not store the image itself in the database. It would really be too big for that. That would be too inefficient. Instead, we'll just store the path to the image as it is stored on our server in the database. So that is what we want to do. Let's start simple and let's add this file picker then. For that, I will go to my post create component here, and I want to add a new button. And I'll add it below the title, let's say. The position is, of course, really up to you. And you could add a mat form field here, but I don't really need one. Instead, I'll just add a div so that we have a block level element, and there I'll add a button, which I'll give the mat button directive so that we turn this into an Angular material button. And I'll say pick image. If we now save this, and ngserve is already up and running, we can go back and we see that pick image button here, which we can click. Now, right now, you can see I get the validation errors when I click this button, because by default, it tries to submit the form. To change this, I'll set the type of this button to button. The alternative and the default would be submit, and it would then try to submit the form. With button, we should no longer get this behavior. Now we can click the button without submitting. Now that's a nice first step, but of course we're not entirely there yet. First of all, I want to change that look slightly. I'll turn this into a matte stroked button so that it will have an outline like this. But of course, the real thing that is missing is the functionality to open that file picker dialog. Now we do actually have a default input which we can use of type file. When we add this, we get this file picker here, which already has a button actually, and where we then can select files and choose them. Now that picker looks a bit ugly, and it doesn't have the default material styling, so I want to hide this picker, not remove it from the DOM. It should be there, it should just be hidden, and instead whenever we click that button, I want to simulate a click event on that picker so that we use that default picker functionality and we store the picked file in that input, but we don't actually see that ugly interface. That's the idea. Now to make that happen, what I'll do is I'll first of all hide that input. We can do that in the CSS file of this component. There I will select the input with the attribute selector, so where type equals file, and I will then set the visibility to hidden. If we do that, then the file picker is gone, but it's still part of the DOM. As you can see if you inspect the elements, here it is, so that still works. And now we can proxy our click on the button onto this input. To do that, I'll give this input a local reference with a hashtag file picker. You can name this however you want. And then here on the button, I'll add a click listener. And on this click listener, I'll simply execute file picker click. So I'll execute this click method on the file picker. And now with that, if we save that, I can click pick image and open the default file picker. So now we successfully proxy that, and we can pick a file and it will be stored. The next step is to register this input as an input of our form. And for this, I'll actually switch to the reactive approach for creating and handling that form, since that gives me more capabilities, more features. And I also want to add my own validator to validate that we only upload image files, for example. And that is an advanced functionality which is way easier to implement if we use the reactive forms approach. So let's switch to this in the next lecture. So as mentioned, I want to switch the way we handle this form. Thus far, we are using the template-driven approach, which means we let Angular detect the form and we register controls with ng-model. And that was working fine thus far, but now that I want to add a little bit more advanced features to the form, like my own validator, it's way easier to do this if we switch to the reactive forms approach. Now, if that doesn't tell you anything, I, as always, strongly recommend checking out my complete guide on Angular. There I dive into this in depth. In the end, the main difference is that with the template-driven approach, which we're currently using, we let Angular infer everything. With the reactive approach, we clearly define everything in our TypeScript code and then just tell Angular which of our defined controls, defined by us in TypeScript, maps to which input here. To use that reactive approach, I first of all need to import something into my app module. Thus far, we import the forms module, and it's added here to the imports array, and this unlocks the template-driven approach. Now I will actually import the reactive forms module, and I'll replace the forms module with that. Not just up here, of course, but also down here in the imports array. Now we unlocked this, and what we also now did is we basically disabled our ng-model here. So if I now would reload, we would get an error that there is no directive with export as set to ng-form. That already fails, but it would also fail regarding ng-model, because this is now not how we handle forms anymore. So let's get rid of ng-model on the first input. Let's also get rid on this local reference post form equals ng-form. We'll also not use that anymore. Additionally, this here won't work anymore, accessing the title with ngModel, that's now gone because we now don't use ngModel anymore. And these validators, we also have to remove them. We'll add validators differently. So therefore, of course, our form will be broken, but we'll fix it soon. For the text area, let's remove ngModel, let's remove the required validator, and let's remove that content local reference there too. Let's remove the argument we passed to onSavePost because we don't have access to the form in the template anymore. And now, of course, in TypeScript, we need to change the way we create our form. So here, we now create our form programmatically. This means that, first of all, we create our form and store it in a property. This will be of type form group. And form group needs to be imported from @Angular forms. So this import here needs to be added. You can actually now remove that ng form input though. Form group is simply the top level object for a form, you could say. A form group groups all the controls of a form. You can also have subgroups in a form if you want to, well, then group controls within a form, but the form overall is just one big group, and we will work with that. So now we got that form, but of course it's undefined. We need to initialize that form and clearly define which controls we have. And we can do that in ng-on-init. That's always a great place for such initialization tasks. There we want to do that initialization. There we can do that initialization right at the beginning, and we can access this form and set it equal to a new form group. So we create a new form group object. This form group object takes a or form group constructor, I should say, takes a JavaScript object as an argument, and here we configure our form. Now you can assign key value pairs here which describe your controls. So for example, if you want to add our title control, we would add title, and you don't have to wrap this in single quotation marks, but it's considered a good practice to be really safe that when your code is later compiled and optimized and uglified, that it's not accidentally, well, removing that name you give it here. So we can assign the name like this, and then here we turn this into a new form control. Form control is another constructor which also is imported from @Angular forms. The form control now creates a single control in the form. And form control takes a couple of arguments. The first argument is the beginning form state. And I will start with null by default to have an empty input. The next argument allows us to attach validators or in general form control options. Such options would be a JavaScript object. And in that object, we can define things like asynchronous validators, which are validators that take a time to finish, and we'll add such an asynchronous validator later when we create a validator for the MIME type of the file we try to upload. We got synchronous validators, and we will actually add some of these synchronous validators. For example, here, I want to add a validator for requiring the title. But before we do that, let's have a look at the last option, and that was update on. Now, update on by default is change. So whenever you type, the validity is checked. But you could also set this to blur to only check the validity when you leave, when the focus leaves that input, for example. But I'll stick to the default. Now, validators is an array of validators we want to add. And thankfully, Angular already ships with some built-in validators. We import the validators class here from @Angular forms, and this gives us access to some built-in validators. And now we can add validators by simply accessing validators dot, and then we get a couple of built-in ones like required. Now important, this is a method, but you shouldn't execute it. Instead, you just pass a reference to the method here, and Angular will execute it on your behalf when it checks the validity of that form control. Now, if you remember, we had not just the required validator for the title, we also had the min-length validator, so we can also add min-length here. Now, min-length needs to be executed because this actually is a factory function which will return the real validator function reference, and we need to execute it to configure the length, and there we could pass free. Now, let me quickly restructure that code so that it's easier to read, and now our title is initialized. Now, of course, we don't just have the title, we also have the content. And I see that my reorganization removed these quotation marks. As I said, you can remove them. It's not a problem normally, but you can also explicitly add them. So now the content. It'll also be a form control. Doesn't matter that it's a text area. All inputs are form controls. And here we also set null as an initial value. And then we add our validators. So we add an object where we set the validators to an array. And here I just want to add validators required. So now we got the same form as before, basically. And let's finish that before we add our file upload. Of course, the form is not done yet. We have our form. What we're missing is the connection to the template. And what we're also missing is the part where we can pre-populate these controls with concrete values in case we are editing a post. Because we always set the starting values to null, but that of course is only correct if we are creating a new post. Now to set an initial value, we can go to our subscription here, where we got our post data here. And then we can reach out to our form, which we initialized a couple of lines above, and call set value here. Set value allows you to override the values for your form controls you registered here. So you pass a JavaScript object here, and you need to set a value for every form control. So here we set title, and we simply set this to a string, this post title. And the same for content, this post content. So with that, we're initializing our post here like that. And now I used auto format again, which removed the quotation marks. So I'll stick to that for now and leave it like this. Again, you could re-add those. But now we're setting a value here. We're initializing the values in case we got a loaded post. Now, when we save the post, we no longer get the form as an argument. Instead, we have our own form object registered on our or as a property in our class. So we access it with this form. We still have the invalid property then. And we can also still access the value property. So that works exactly the same. So value and then title. The value property will still be a JavaScript object where our control names, so the names we assign here, title and content, map to names in that value object so that we can conveniently access the values entered from the user or by the user on the same names here, title and content. This of course means that if you were to change the names up here, then you also need to change them down here when you access the values. Now here I also will access this form value, title and content. So now we're almost done. Now for resetting, we just call this form reset, not reset form, it's just reset. And now we're done with the TypeScript code. Now what's missing is the part where we synchronize our HTML code to our TypeScript. So where we tell Angular which input here relates to which control we created here. Because you could of course argue that the title control should obviously be that input because it has the name title, but Angular doesn't infer this. It gives you the flexibility of defining no name here, you can now remove that, or a different name. So instead of relying on something like this, what you do instead is you add a special directive here. However, first of all, you add a directive to your overall form, the form group directive. This form group directive takes your form object, so form here, because in TypeScript we have that form property. It takes this and basically tells Angular, hey, for the form I created in TypeScript, this is the HTML form. And now here on the input, we can use a different directive, form control name, and type the name of the control as we defined it here. So title, for example. So now we pass title here, and we're not wrapping this in square brackets because we're just passing a string. This is a shortcut. You could wrap it in square brackets to do property binding, but then you would have to pass a string here with single quotation marks. So here, if you pass title, that's the equivalent. So the other syntax is, of course, shorter, which is why I'm using it like this. And now we connected this input to our form control. Now to hook up that error, I now need to be able to access my title form control. And we do this by accessing the overall form. And there you have a get method which gives you access to a control where you pass the control name as a title. And then you should have an invalid property there because this will now be the form control you selected and it checks if that is valid. Now we can do the same for the text area, and definitely feel free to do this on your own. Pause the video, do it on your own. What I'll do is I'll add my form control name there too, the form control name directive, and make sure you get the casing correct here. And the name, of course, is content there. And now for the met error, I therefore access form get and then content as a string. Now we should have a working form again. We should be able to do everything we did before, but now with the reactive approach. So if we save everything and I try this, does this work? And we don't need to pick an image yet, we're not handling it. I can save this post and I see it here. And if I edit it and I add an extra exclamation mark, this also works. So now we're having a working form again, but with the reactive approach. Well, that's great, but we haven't really advanced our app from a functionality perspective, right? So time to go back to that image picker and finally take advantage of the reactive form and handle that image picking. So I now want to make sure that we can click the pick image button, select the image, and then actually store this as an input, as a value in our form. Now, we already connected the button here to the image picker. The next step is to do something whenever an image was picked. Right now, we just proxy that click, but we don't handle the case that the user then picks the image. Now, to handle that case too, we can register an event on the image picker, so on the file picker here, the change event. This will fire whenever the user changes the selected file. So if he changes from no file selected to here is a file, or if he changes the file thereafter. So there I want to execute an event, or a method I should say, and that method is onImagePicked. The name is of course up to you. Now I will call that and I will actually forward the native DOM event we're getting here. And I can access this with $event. That's this special variable Angular gives me to access the event object an event, well, had. And this change event has an event object. I can access it with $event, and therefore I can forward it to onImagePicked by passing it as an argument. With that, let's go to the TypeScript code and add this method. There, I'll add onImagePicked, and I do expect to get an event object here. The type will be event. And that is a default type which you don't have to import. It's provided by TypeScript out of the box because it's a default JavaScript type. So we got our event object here. And now I want to extract the file which was added. So I'll create a new constant file, and I can access this by accessing event target, which is the, well, target on which we clicked, and then the file's property. The problem just is TypeScript doesn't know that our event target actually is a input, a file input, and therefore it doesn't know that this file's property exists. Now, we can solve this by converting this, or by explicitly telling TypeScript that this will be of type HTML input element. For that, we can simply wrap event target with parentheses and then add as HTML input element. This does a so-called type conversion, and it clearly tells TypeScript that this entire expression here will be an HTML input element, which happens to have a files property. Now, files is an array of files, but we will only select one, so we can simply take the first element from that array, which is the file the user selected. So now we got that, and that's great. The next step is, of course, that we want to store this in a form control. Right now, our form only has two controls, title and content. I now want to change this and actually add a new control. So let's add a third control here, and I'll name this image. The name is totally up to you. I'll simply create a new form control here, as before. And in this form control, I initially will set a value of null. We'll later change this or update this down here to also set a value if we got a post, but for now let's go with null here. So we've got the null value here for a new post. I will add a validator, so I will add my configuration with validators, and I will add the required validator because I want to ensure that this is not empty. Now, one thing I'm not doing here is I won't bind this to any HTML element. You could think that I bind it to this input, to the file picker, but I actually won't do that because we don't see that anyways, and I don't want to display anything there. I also don't want to display an error here on that, at least not like this. So I will not synchronize this to HTML. And that's the cool thing about the reactive approach. We don't have to synchronize this. Instead, we can totally manage a value behind the scenes in TypeScript only. So this is now a control of the form, and we can control the value it has manually with TypeScript. Therefore, when we submit it, we can access the value. We don't have to synchronize it to HTML if we don't have a fitting element there. So we got that image control now, and in onImagePicked, I can now do that, well, type or that value assignment I was referring to. I can reach out to my form because it's controlled in TypeScript, and then I can call patch value. Now, set value is something you already saw. There you would set the values of all inputs or all controls of your form. Patch value allows you to target a single control, and that's exactly what I want to do here. So we pass an object there too, then the name of the control, which is image in my case, and then the value, and that is the file. Please note, the entire file, which is a file object in JavaScript. So this is no text, this is a file object. You are not limited to storing text in your form. That's another cool thing about that reactive approach. So now we're storing the file object here. Now one thing I need to do is I need to reach out to my form, get access to my image here, and call update value and validity. This basically informs Angular that I changed the value and that it should re-evaluate that, store that value internally, and also check whether the value I did patch is valid. And that will run the validator on this input, even though the user never directly typed in there. So that's really, really cool. Now with that, let's do something. Let's console log our file here, and let's console log our form here when we pick an image to see if that works. So now if I go back and create a new post, let's pick an image, my Spring JPEG file, and we do see the file here. We do see the form group here, and if we inspect the value there, we can see that indeed for the value that file was assigned and is stored here, and that's the file object as managed by JavaScript. Now that's the first important step. We can store that in our form. Of course, we're not submitting it yet, we're not uploading it yet, and before we even do that, it would also be nice to see a preview of that image, I guess. So let's work on that preview thing next. So now that we can actually store our image here, let's display a preview to the user. And to display such a preview here, I'll actually add something in my HTML code. Below my picker here, I want to present an image. So I'll add a div here, and I'll give that div a class, CSS class, of image preview maybe. Totally up to you how you name that. And in there, I'll add a normal image element, and we will have to bind that source and alt title here. Well, alt, I'll simply immediately bind this with property binding to access the underlying property. I'll bind this to form value title, so whatever we entered as a title will be our alt title. But of course, the interesting part is the image. Now, to display the image there, I need to convert the file to something which can be displayed. And for this, in onImagePicked, I want to convert my image to a so-called data URL, which is a URL that can be used by the normal image tag. For that, I'll first of all add a new property, and that will be my image preview. image preview will be a string, and then on image picked, I want to populate this with that derived URL. Now, to create that URL, we'll have to use a feature provided by JavaScript, which is called the file reader. I'll store a new instance of it because we have to instantiate that. I'll store that in that reader constant. Now we can use that reader and define an onLoad event here, which will just be a function that gets executed. So that's a function which is executed when it's done loading a certain resource. And in there, I want to set this image preview equal to reader result. This is how that works. Now, it won't do anything unless we tell it to do something. So here I will call reader read data as URL. Now, what we're doing with that, whoops, and I should pass in my file. So what I'm doing with that is I'm creating the reader. Then I'm defining something which should happen when it's done reading in a file, when it's done loading a file. And then I instruct it to load that file. Now, this here is asynchronous code. This will take a while, which is why I'm using that callback here, that function I assigned to onLoad. And this will actually kick off the process, which will eventually lead to that event being fired. And here we will have the read in file, and we can then, well, result will automatically be that URL we're looking for. So here I can then simply assign this to my image preview. So image preview will eventually be something which we can display. So let's display it. For that, let's go back to the HTML code. And on my div here, I'll first of all add ngIf to not always show that preview, because I don't want to show a blank image. I don't want to show an image that can't be loaded. And here I'll check if image preview is not equal to an empty string, and also if image preview is not null. Or short form, simply if image preview. So if it exists, and if it's not equal to an empty string. If that's the case, then I will load this div and the image which is in it, and I'll bind the source tag of the image to image preview. So to that string we have, whoops, preview like that. So to that string which will store that data URL. Now this would look ugly like that. So let's go to the CSS file and style our image preview class here. There I will give it a height of, let's say, 5 rem and a margin of, let's say, 1 rem and 0 to left and right to have some distance between the preview and the surrounding inputs. And then I'll also access the image, which is nested in my class here, and set its maximum height to 100% of the container, so to these 5 rem. With that, let's save all that. Let's go back. We don't see an image preview yet. And if I select my Spring image here, we actually see it there. So that's pretty cool. Now we got that little preview, and of course you can change the way this is displayed with CSS. And now with that added, the next step, of course, is to validate whether this is an image and not a PDF document, and also then to ensure that we can upload it. So with the image preview being displayed, let's work on validating that. We are validating that we got an image. Well, that's nice, but of course it would be nicer if we could also validate that we have a valid image. So if we have a JPEG or PNG file, let's say. And there is no built-in validator that would help us with that. So let's write our own one. I will write it in a separate file here, and I'll name it mime-type.validator.ts. You can name the file however you want. I just want to make sure that it's clear that this is a validator, and I will validate the MIME type of a file here. Now, the MIME type validator will have the task of getting the value of a control, which will be a file, of course, then read that using that file reader again, and then checking for the MIME type of that file. And we will write the logic for this together. It's a little bit more complex, a little bit more advanced JavaScript, but we'll get there. So to read this file, or to create such a validator, let's start with that. I will first of all export constant because this validator will actually just be a function. All validators are just functions which read in the control value and return the information whether that is valid or not. So I'll name that Mime-Type, and the name is totally up to you. Now again, I said it's a function, so it's an arrow function which looks something like this. And now the question, of course, is what's the argument? The argument is the control, which is of type abstract control, something you import from @Angular forms. So we get this control as an argument. We also have to return something, and this will actually be an asynchronous validator because reading in that file with the file reader is an asynchronous task, as you saw there. We have to register some events which the reader will fire when it's done reading this in, because parsing such a file takes a bit longer, and to not block the JavaScript execution, this is handled asynchronously. Since it's an asynchronous validator, something Angular does support, I have to define a special return type for this validator function. A normal synchronous validator would simply return a JavaScript object where you have a key value pair with your own error code and then a value for that error code, or null. If a validator returns null, the value is treated to be valid. That's important. Null means valid. If you return an object with that error code and that value for the error code, then this would mean it failed. Now for an async validator, it's almost the same, but that JavaScript object with the error code is actually wrapped by a promise or an observable. So we either return a promise here, or we return an observable here. Now, these are both generic types actually, and the observable is something I need to import first anyways. So let's import observable from RxJS. That's that third-party package which provides the observable. The promise is a default JavaScript type, but as I said, both are generics, which means we can be clear about which value they will eventually yield. And for the promise, that will simply be that JavaScript object I mentioned. And now here comes a strange notation where we have any property, so we don't care about the name, we just want to say it should have a property, and we do that with square brackets key of type string. This just means, hey, this will have a property which can be interpreted as a string, and we don't care about the name. These square brackets here don't indicate an array, they just indicate that this is really a dynamic property name. And then the value of that property will be anything. We can pass any value we want for that error code. And this will become clearer once we do return a value. And it's the same generic type for the observable, so let's add it there too. Now this is our function definition. We of course get an error because right now we're not fulfilling it. We aren't returning a promise or an observable. So let's work on that function body now. First of all, let's extract the file. So I'll create my file constant and access my control value. Now I need to tell TypeScript that this is a file because it could be anything. We can't store anything as a value. So now we tell TypeScript that this will be a file. And then we can use that file reader again. So file reader is new file reader. We instantiated that a second ago in the last lecture. Now that file reader can be used to read in that value of the file. Now I will use a different syntax. Previously what we did is we added file reader and then onload. Now first of all we now need onload end, but still this approach now wouldn't really work. Because keep in mind, in this function here, I need to return a promise or an observable. Now this is neither. This is synchronous code which just registers a function. Thankfully, RxJS gives us something which allows us to convert this into an observable. We can simply create our own observable. To do that, I will create a new constant and I'll name it FROBS for file reader observable. And I will create my own observable by calling observable and there the static create method. With that, we can create our own observable from scratch. Now, such an observable takes a function as an argument. That function then again automatically gets an observer that's passed in by RxJS, and it's of type observer. You import that from RxJS too. Now that observer simply is a tool you use to control when this observable emits new data. So in here, in that observable, I can now take my file reader and add an event listener. There we can listen to the load end event. That's an equivalent to file reader on load end. So I'm creating a listener like this, and here I have another function which will eventually get executed once this is done. Now we also get that error on the observer because this actually turns out to be a generic type, and the type here actually is exactly the same JavaScript object our whole validator will eventually emit. So let's add this here as a generic type. Now back to the event listener. We know that we're done reading in the file here, and the difference between load end and load really just is that for load end, it has more information about the file, you could say. So now we have that event listener here, and in here, we then basically want to emit a new value with the information whether we know that this is a valid file or not. And we know it inside this event listener because of that extra information I just mentioned. Now before we implement this, let's go in the line after add event listener. And here we want to start that process by using our file reader to actually read in the file, but now not as data URL, but as array buffer. This will then allow us to access the MIME type. So now we pass the file there, we read it in as an array buffer. When it's done, add event listener load end will actually call this function, and now in this function we can do the Mime-Type validation. Let's implement this logic in the next lecture. So let's add that Mime-Type validation now here in the event listener. We now know that we have this array buffer. Let's first of all create a new array with uint8 array. This creates a new array of 8-bit unsigned integers. And that's the part I meant where we get really advanced. In the end, you can just think of this as a way that allows us to access or to read certain patterns in the file, and not just in the file, but also in the file metadata that we can then use to parse the MIME type. Because we don't just want to check the file extension, that could be changed. You could upload a PDF as a JPEG file. We want to really infer that file type by looking into that file. And that uint8 array allows us to do this. That is also why we read this in as an array buffer, because we can easily convert this to such a uint8 array. We can convert this by simply passing in the file reader result here again. Now actually, we need to access a sub-array here, 0 to 4. This simply is the part which allows us to get that MIME type. And if you want to learn more about uint arrays and so on, you probably don't need to, but if you want, you should dive into some advanced JavaScript resources, but this is really something you rarely do on your own. So here in the end, we get an array, which will in the end allow us to, well, infer the file type. Now, to really get that file type, we need to read a certain pattern. And that pattern is read in with a for loop. There we'll go through the array we got here. So a normal for loop, I smaller r length, I plus plus. And we need to extract certain information from that array. For that, I'll create a new variable, header, which initially is an empty string. And then in that for loop here, I'll attach something to that string with the plus equal operator. I'll attach the element we're currently looking at in our loop, and then to string, and I need to pass an argument of 60 to convert this to a hexadecimal string. Now we're building a string of hexadecimal values. Now we can switch that header we built here, because now we will already have, well, already, I guess it was quite some work, we will have a string which actually has a clearly defined pattern for the different file types. Now, I actually prepared some code here, which you find attached to this video. You can just copy and paste it in and replace the switch statement with it. It's this code. There, I check for certain patterns, and these really are patterns which stand for certain file types. PNGs and JPEGs to be precise. And you can Google JavaScript file Mime-Type to find more examples and detailed instructions on how this actually works and which identifier here stands for which file type. Now I'm creating, or I'm using a isValid variable there, so let's create this too, isValid, and let's set it to false initially, so we assume that the file is not valid, but we'll overwrite it if we find a valid PNG or JPEG file. If we got any other MIME type which does not match one of these patterns, then we treat it as invalid. Now this was quite a lot of work and quite advanced, I'll certainly say that, but now we're done. Now we have that isValid variable, and now all we need to do is we need to use that observer, which I said we could use to control the observable and how it emits data, to emit data. So we'll check if isValid is true here, and if it is, I will call observer next to emit a new value, and that value here will be null, because remember, you have to return null, and return here means emit in the observable, if it is valid. If it is not valid, you instead emit a different value, that strange JavaScript object. There I said you could use any error code you want, like invalid MIME type, that's totally up to you, and pass any value you want, like true. So now we emit these two values. Thereafter, I will also call observer complete to let any subscribers know that we're done. And now we just have to return that observable, the file reader observable, which we're creating here. So at the very end of all of that, here, I will return this observable. And now we should have a valid file type validator. We can now attach it to our form by going back to the post create component. And first of all, let's import it. So let's import the Mime-Type Validator from our Mime-Type Validator file. So the name was Mime-Type, this function. I said validators are functions, so that's exactly what we need. And now we add it to the image control here, not as a validator though, but as an async validator. Angular does differentiate between these. There you simply add Mime-Type. Now we're initializing that image in a way that we only accept images. And I can prove this to you. If we save everything, and we go back to our form, I can enter something and pick an image. And if I take that video file here and hit Save Post, you see it's not submitting. If I take my image on the other hand, Spring JPEG, not only do we get a valid preview, and we should fix this to not give a preview if it's invalid, but I do not only get this, I can now also save this. So this is working. We still don't upload it, but the validation is working. Now I just said we should also go to the HTML file and make sure our preview is not only shown if we got a valid image preview value here, but we also want to check if form get image actually is valid. Because if it's not valid, well then we certainly don't want to show the preview. So with that saved, if we go back, new post, and pick our video here again, we don't see our preview. So now we're doing the validation here, and the cool thing is, now the entire rest of the form will work. So like here in onSave post, where we check if the form is invalid, well, you already saw this in action. We weren't able to submit because it automatically detected that this is not valid, because it runs all validators whenever it needs to validate the input, which for the file happens when we call update value and validity, and it executes them. And our own validator simply returns something which is not null, which means it's not valid if we don't have a valid MIME type. So that's validation added. Now let's finally move on to the file upload. So time to go back to the server and implement that file upload functionality. Now what does uploading a file actually mean? It means that on the server, we kind of need to extract such a file, byte, body from our incoming request. And we can't do that with body parser. This only works for JSON or URL encoded data, but not for files. To extract files too, we need to install a different package. So I'll quit one of the processes here, and install that package with npm install -- save. The name is Malter. This is a package for Node.js and for Express to be precise, which allows us to extract incoming files. So after this is stored, downloaded, and saved, I'll restart ngserve, and now we can use it. Now, how do we use it? Well, we can use Malter by simply attaching it to certain routes that should be able to accept files. So in our post.js file, in the routes file, that would be our post route here. There we create a new post, and that post would include a file. It would also include other data, but also the file. Now, to use Malter on this route, we first of all need to import it in the post.js file. So I'll name a constant Malter, and then I will simply require Malter here. Now, Malter needs some configuration. So let's create a new constant, maybe here, and I'll name it storage. The name is up to you. I'll name it storage because it's related to file storage. And there we need to define where Malter should put files which it detects in the incoming request. We do this by calling Malter disk storage. And by the way, if you want to learn more about Malter, definitely check out their GitHub repository, where you find a detailed documentation of how it works and the different features of it you can use. But back to our code, I said we can call disk storage here to configure how Malter does store things. You pass a JavaScript object to disk storage, and there you can set two keys. One is destination. Destination is a function which will be executed whenever Malter tries to save a file it detected. This function will get the request object, the file which it extracted, and a callback. You need to call that callback to basically, pass back that where should you store it information to Malter. So you could run a complex logic here, but I will simply call that callback, and to that callback you need to pass two things. The first argument is whether you detected some error. I'll set null here. The second argument simply is a string with the path to the folder where this should be stored. And I want to store it in the backend folder, and there, images. Now important, this path is seen relative of your server.js file. So this is relative to the path where your server.js file is stored. That is why I have to add backend here, even though we are in the routes folder in the backend folder. Now, I'm targeting an image folder here, and this doesn't exist yet, so let's add it, images. You can, of course, name this however you want. Just make sure to update it here too. And now Malter would be able to write there. We're not done though. This is the destination. We also can, and here want, to tell Malter what the file name should be. So this is another function where we get the request, the file, and a callback. And here I'll first of all extract the name. We can get that from the file. There is an original name property. Now I also want to normalize this a bit. So I'll first of all convert it to all lowercase. Then I'll split it by white spaces I might have, and then join it again with a dash, so that any white space in the file name will be replaced with a dash. The problem is this will miss the file extension. We can extract that too though. We can get the file Mime-Type to be precise. That's cool. Malter automatically gives us the Mime-Type, something we had to do with hard work on the front end. Now, I will create a little helper constant here, Mime-Type map, to have a map of Mime-Types and which extension that would be. I want to support 3 types of files, and for image PNG, that would be the Mime-Type, I will use PNG as an extension. For image/JPEG as a Mime-Type, I would use JPEG. And for image/JPEG, written like this, I will also use JPEG. So these will be my Mime-Types. Now I want to get the extension, and I can do this by creating a new constant here in the file name function, extension, and there I'll use my Mime-Type map and pass in the file Mime-Type property. That will be in this format, and now we will simply select the Mime-Type from this map. And we should only get such MIME types since we filter on the front end. I can then call a callback here too to pass that information to Malter. We don't have an error. And now I can construct my name here by using the name plus, let's say, a dash, plus, let's say, a timestamp with date now. I can get the current timestamp, plus a dot, and then the extension. This should construct a unique file name based on the input file name, the current date, and the correct extension. Now, of course, we're validating the incoming files on the front end. Still, as an extra security layer, in destination, I want to throw and return an error if we detect that we don't have one of these MIME types. And I should be able to do this by creating a new constant is valid. And here, I will use my MIME type map and pass in the file MIME type. And this should actually return nothing, undefined, null, if we get a MIME type that's not part of this map. So I'll then create a new error here with the new keyword, new error, pass a message here, invalid MIME type. And I will then check if is valid, if that is true. So if it's not null or undefined, if we did find something, then I'll set error equal to null. Otherwise, I'll leave the error message here, and I will now pass error here. So with that, we configured Malter. It now knows where to store things and how to store them. Of course, we're not using it though. And we do use it, for example, on this post route, by passing it as an extra middleware. And that's the cool thing about Express. Thus far, we have one filter, the path, and then the function we want to execute. And we can pass as many arguments as we want here, and they will execute from left to right. So first we parse this path here, and now I will pass in another function, and that will do something to the request before our function runs. And that function I want to use here is Malter. Then I'll pass in my configuration, so storage here. And then I will call single here. This means I'm expecting a single file, and I'll pass image as an argument, as a string. This simply means Malter will now try to extract a single file from the incoming request, and it will try to find it on an image property in the request body. And it will be our job to provide this, of course. That's the backend setup. Now, in order to be able to test it, we need to add the upload functionality in the Angular code then. Back to the frontend then, to the post service to be precise. When adding a post, we'll now have to upload our file. Or to be precise, we want to send a request that includes both our normal data and the file. Previously, what we did is we used the post method, and we simply attached the post object here as a body, and that would automatically send it as JSON to the backend. Now, JSON can't include a file, so I will now edit this. Instead of sending JSON, I will now send form data. So let's create a new constant and name it post data. The name is up to you. And this will be a new form data object. This is our object provided by JavaScript. And form data is basically a data format which allows us to combine text values and blob, so file values. We use it by now accessing post data, and we append fields to it, like title. Title is one field, and the value for that would be the title we get as an argument. Now, as you might be able to guess, we do the same for content, of course. Now it gets more interesting for the file, but also not that interesting. We append again, and we give this a name of image. Now important, this is the property we're trying to access on the backend here, so make sure that you got that right. And the interesting thing here is, of course, I now need to add my image here. We're not getting it as an argument yet, so let's change this. Here I'll get my image, which will simply be of type file. So now I can pass my image here, and I pass an extra argument, which will be the file name I provide to the backend. And here I want to use the title the user entered for the post. And keep in mind, this will be part of the file name as it is saved on the backend, so this is not unimportant. So now I'm passing the image and this title for the image, and this is my readily configured post data. Now, the cool thing about the Angular HTTP client is we can simply pass post data, and it will automatically set the right headers, detect that we got non-JSON data or data which can't be sent as JSON, and all that will be handled by the Angular HTTP client. Now, in the subscription, I just need to make sure that we still save a post, and for that, I'll create my post here, post, which is of type post, of course, assign my ID here, which is response data post ID, assign my title here, which is the title I get as an argument, and assign my content. I'll also need to store the image, of course, but we don't get this back yet, so let's do this later. So now that's updated here in the subscription. Now we got our logic in place. Now one thing that's missing is we're not passing the image to add post. So in the post create component where we are calling this, I should of course forward this by accessing this form value image. And now we're extracting the image, which is a control of this form, and we're extracting the value and we're passing this to add post. Now we should indeed be able to upload a file. So let's give this a try. Let's enter file upload test1 with some content, and let's check or choose the Spring JPEG file. Let's hit save post. Takes a while, which is a good sign because uploading obviously takes a bit longer. And now let's have a look. We got the images folder, but it's empty. So let's check the server-side log. There I don't see any problems. So what could be going wrong here? Yeah, I know what's wrong in our server-side post.js file. When I set up Malter here, passing storage like this is incorrect. I need to pass a JavaScript object which has a storage property, which then should get my storage configuration. So that was a mistake. So let's save this. Let's delete the file upload test and let's test it again. So file upload test2, I guess. Let's pick our image again here. Let's hit save post and see if that worked. Now looks better. In the images folder, there is our file. So indeed, we were successful. We did upload it. Now, of course, we're missing a couple of things. We're not telling the client where this is stored. We need to return this. And I also want to check whether we're able to upload invalid data. So let's go back and let's temporarily disable our front-end validation so that we can actually submit any file, that we ignore the result of our Mime-Type validation. Let's enter some dummy value here, pick an image, and let's pick that video file. You can, of course, pick any PDF, anything which is not an image. Hit open and click save. Now that's a big error. And I get an error already. If I expand this terminal, I get my invalid Mime-Type error. So this validation is working. We're not handling the error gracefully on the client. We'll do this later. For now, let's comment in the validation on the client, but this shows that the validation is working on the server, on the client, and that we're able to upload files. So with that, let's continue. Let's make sure we also pass back that file information to the client so that we can use it there, that we store it in the database, and of course also that we later can update files.